Hi, guys, and welcome to our next lesson. And so, yesterday we got an introduction to the Enlightenment, right? We had like an overview, we did a web quest on it. And on Monday, we talked about the development of democracy in England, things like the Magna Carta and the English Bill of Rights. And so, today we're kind of jumping into learning more in depth about what this age of enlightenment, this age of reason, what it was, how it came about, what kind of led to it, how it's connected to um, what we learned about already, and in particular, who were some of the major figures in the Enlightenment. Today, we're going to talk about three in particular, named Machiavelli, John Locke, and Thomas Hobbes. And we're going to be talking about some of the questions that they debated, and what kind of impact that this age of enlightenment, has had on later periods of our history, including things like the Industrial Revolution, and also like what kind of lasting impact the Enlightenment has had on the world of today. So make sure, if you haven't yet, to answer the bell ringer that I've posted on Google Classroom. One of the big questions that the philosophers during this period debated and discussed was whether or not human beings are naturally born good or evil. And I want to know what you think. Do you think humans are naturally born good or evil? So make sure to answer that question. Now, for the objective of today, what you're going to be able to do by the end of this lesson is we're going to talk about Hobbes and Locke, the two philosophers, more in depth and more in detail. And you are going to need to be able to identify their beliefs on government and on humanity. And I want you to be able to compare and contrast them. So there is a Venn diagram that you are going to need to complete by the end of the lesson today in order to demonstrate that you know the differences between these two philosophers as well as their similarities. So make sure, as we go through this presentation, as you're filling out the notes, that you really pay attention, close attention to those ideas as they are presented. So let's talk a little bit about how the Age of Enlightenment came to be, what led to it. So really, as we got into the 1500s, the year 1500, the Renaissance had been going on for nearly 200 years. And if you don't remember what the Renaissance is from middle school history, the Renaissance really took place between the years 1300 and 1500, right? And it was a time of revival for art and literature. And, there were a lot of paintings, famous paintings, and um, statues that were created during this time. Some of the most famous artists in world history came about during this period. And especially Europe had been rediscovering the knowledge from the Greeks and from the Romans during this time. That's why a lot of the most famous Renaissance painters and artists, uh, they, their art looked very much similar to and inspired and influenced by the Greeks and the Romans. If you think back to some of our lessons on Greece and Rome, and remember those images from, the videos that I made, a lot of the statues look very similar, if not identical in some cases. Right? They have replicas that are created during this time. So the Renaissance is something where the you can see the Europeans especially are uh, rediscovering this knowledge, rediscovering Greco-Roman culture, which had been lost during the Middle Ages, during the Dark Ages. And Nicholas Copernicus is a man who lived during this period of time, and he published something called On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres. And this publication is famous for suggesting that the Earth is not the center of the universe, but that the Earth revolves around the sun. And what was really powerful about this is that it challenged uh, ideas that were hundreds of years old about how the universe worked. And his publication, it was about using new methods and new and evidence in order to make conclusions, no matter how revolutionary those conclusions might be. And Copernicus's publication is often cited as the beginning of what will be known as the scientific revolution. And many people believe that the capstone, the height of the scientific revolution, is Isaac Newton and his publication of Principia in 1687. And this is an incredibly powerful publication. It describes and lays out the laws of the universe, the basic laws of the universe. And it describes the universe as one in which most things can be explained with simple principles, right? So Isaac Newton asserts that mathematics can explain how and why the universe works the way that it does. And things like the law of gravity, the laws of motion is published and put forth by Isaac Newton during this scientific revolution. And it's really powerful. And it's something that wouldn't be challenged for over 200 years until Albert Einstein comes on the scene, right? With his theories of relativity. But even today, Isaac Newton's laws, this is what is taught in your first year physics class. This is what you learn in your introductory engineering class. So there's many things to think about. Why did this revolution happen at this period of time, and how it's related to the Renaissance, and how it's related to things that were happening in politics in Europe at this time. But needless to say, it gave humanity the scientific revolution gave humanity a new perspective on the universe. It gave us new powers, and we began to challenge old assumptions. And so as we get into the 1600s and the early 1700s, people start trying to use these same tools, to use the scientific method, to use deductive reasoning, to try to answer some of the oldest philosophical questions that humanity has ever asked itself, including questions like, what rights do we have as human beings? Is there a such thing as human rights? Who gets those rights? What duty and obligation do we have towards each other as human beings? What is the role of the government, right? And this is something we're going to talk about today. And who has the right to rule? Now, some of these questions have been asked by philosophers and religion for thousands of years. Some other questions that have been asked, like, what if God doesn't exist? What if humanity is not the center of the universe? And what if there's no absolute truth, right? So, like I said, some of these questions have been debated, and some have been answered, quote unquote, answered by philosophers, and some religions have tried answering these questions as well. But now, with the scientific revolution, there was the power and the tools and the challenging notions of the scientific revolution that tried to answer these questions. And when they tried to use these tools and these methods to answer these questions, this philosophical movement came about, and it is known as the Enlightenment, right? So we try to use science and reason to answer these questions. That's what the Enlightenment is. And here is a discussion. It's also known as the Age of Reason. So anytime I say Age of Enlightenment, it also means the Age of Reason. And the Age of Reason took place between 1650 and 1800, and it's defined as a breaking away from traditional ideas, right? Those old ideas, to try to form the foundations of modern democracy. And it helped to inspire, to create important documents and ideas, including the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, right? So it's very influential, this Age of Reason. And it's directly influential on our society that we live in today. And when I say reason, Age of Reason, Age of Enlightenment, the word reason means to draw or come to a conclusion about something, right? So it's the age of coming to conclusions, to trying to find answers and answering these questions. And I'm going to take a second. I want to pause and ask you, what do you think gave people the confidence during this time that they could break away from these old ideas and try to find the answers, the new answers and new evidence to answer these questions? What do you think gave people confidence to be able to do this during this time? So now just let's have an example of some of the thinking that defined and took place during the Enlightenment. What kind of Enlightenment thinking is there? What does it look like? So here is a passage from John Locke, and John Locke is considered to be one of the pillars of the Enlightenment. And this is published in 1689, and it's the second treatise concerning civil government. And it states, "The state of nature has a law of nature to govern it, which obliges everyone in reason, which is that law." So basically, he's saying reason is the law of nature to govern it. And it teaches mankind, who will but consult it, that being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. And when his own preservation comes not in competition, ought he, as much as he can, to preserve the rest of mankind, and may not, unless it be to do justice on an offender, take away or impair the life or what tends to the preservation of the life, the liberty, health, limb, or goods of another. And just to like summarize what he's saying here, he's saying that reason is this natural law that should govern human action and interaction, right? So reason is a natural law to govern how we interact with each other. And he's saying that no one should harm another person, and that if we're not in competition, right? So you shouldn't harm anybody if we're not in competition. So, for example, maybe there's only two of us, right? And we don't have enough food, right? Then there would be competition. But if there isn't that competition, if there is enough food, if there is enough resources, we should be trying to help each other, and we should be trying to preserve the rest of mankind. And unless it's for the purpose of justice, right? Unless it's for the purpose of someone who's committed a crime, you do not have the right to take away or impair the life or things that help preserve the life, the liberty, the health, the goods of another, right? So you don't have a right to take away someone's property, to kill somebody, to imprison them, unless they've committed a crime, unless they have taken away those rights of another person. So you might be thinking, isn't this common sense, right? And religion for all of time has touched on some of these issues and these topics and answered some of these questions. But you have to also appreciate that this is a time when kings and emperors ruled the world. What gave them that right to rule the world? Why are certain people slaves and other people not slaves? Why do certain people in the world have a right to own these other people? Right? So religion didn't always answer that question. And if it had answered those questions, then there wouldn't have been slavery at the time. Then there wouldn't have been these people arguing over whether this is okay or not to have slavery, for example. So this is a controversial idea, John Locke's idea, and it challenged some of these fundamental notions of who should govern, who should rule, who has the right to rule, and to what degree should people exert control over another. And so it kind of, given these challenging notions of the Enlightenment, and John Locke was really only one of the actors, one of the figures of the Enlightenment who's prominent during this period. It's not surprising that as you get into the late 1700s and early 1800s, you start to have a string of revolutions, especially in the American Revolution, which was inspired by a large degree by the ideas of the Enlightenment. Things like life, liberty, health are specifically cited in the United States Declaration of Independence. Also, during the French Revolution, which we will have a whole unit on, these things are discussed and cited. And also in various revolutions in Latin America, these ideas are talked about and discussed and cited for reasons why they rebel against Spain, why the U.S. rebels against Britain. It comes down to these Enlightenment ideas. They were inspired by these Enlightenment ideas that challenged the traditional view of the role of government and who should be in charge. Now, one of the reasons why the Enlightenment came about when it did, not only did we have new tools of thinking and the opportunity to challenge notions, but it might have also been that society now had the responsibility to think a little bit deeper about these ideas because it was getting more and more powers through the scientific revolution. And those powers were becoming even more significant when that science was applied during the Industrial Revolution. So the Enlightenment has a connection, a deep connection with the Industrial Revolution and the Age of Imperialism. And just to be clear, the Industrial Revolution and the Age of Imperialism came after the Enlightenment. But the Enlightenment played a role in why these two periods of time, the Industrial Revolution and the Age of Imperialism, end up taking place, right? So during the Industrial Revolution, people were able to apply the science and the tools that came about during the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution in order to produce more than they could ever produce before, right? And we were also able to create more powerful weapons, right, during this period, during the Industrial Revolution. And because of that, we needed raw materials in order to continue to industrialize. We needed natural resources in order to be able to do that, right? And this desire leads to imperialism with these new weapons that were created during the Industrial Revolution. There were more ways for countries to project power and to control a large empire, right? There were new methods of communication that came about during the Industrial Revolution and methods of force. And they were able to be utilized and applied by people, especially Western European powers, in order to get more raw materials and markets. And in order to do that, they had to conquer other lands, such as the Americas, right? Or Africa, places in Africa. And in Southeast Asia as well. And they needed these. They wanted these markets and this raw materials so that they could push their finished products that they made to these areas. And so the industrialized world had more and more power. And so these ideas of the Enlightenment became even more relevant, even though they might not have been implemented consistently during the Age of Imperialism. The Enlightenment actually helped to bring about the Industrial Revolution and the Age of Imperialism. So there were some positive effects as well as some negative effects, and we'll go more in depth into this a little bit later. And as we know, even though the technology, because as we know, even though the technology kept accelerating during the Industrial Revolution, the philosophy and the moral framework, right, human rights that we've been talking about, they don't accelerate along with Industrial Revolution and the Age of Imperialism. We end up seeing one of the bloodiest periods of human history in the 20th century with World War I and World War II. So the Enlightenment, it wasn't universally influential, right? So what I mean by that is some of these ideas, these debates over human rights and who should govern and who has the right to rule, they didn't necessarily they weren't implemented consistently, right? It tended to be implemented and in white societies, right? And the emphasis on human rights was not extended, unfortunately, to many people of color. So that's what I'm trying to say, is that it was the Enlightenment had some benefits and it benefited some groups, but it didn't necessarily benefit everybody equally, as maybe some of the people in the Enlightenment would have hoped. So, where did the Enlightenment or the Age of Reason take place? And it took place mostly in Europe, as I've been talking about. In particular, France, Britain, and Germany had some of the highest number of philosophers and some of the most influential philosophers during this period. people like Immanuel Kant, like I've been talking about, Thomas Hobbes, and John Locke from Britain. And then in France, we had Voltaire, Baron de Montesquieu, we had Jean-Jacques Rousseau, right? Those are just a few of them, and we'll talk more about each of them later. And they influenced all of Europe. It wasn't so, even though a lot of the philosophers came from these countries, the Enlightenment influenced not only all of Europe, but it also influenced the world. But in particular, it influenced Russia and Scandinavia as well. Now, who were some of the most important and notable figures of the Enlightenment? There is a list here. Three of them that we're going to look at today are Niccolo Machiavelli, Thomas Hobbes, and John Locke. And in some of our upcoming lessons, we'll talk about Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Baron de Montesquieu, Denis Diderot, Voltaire, Mary Wollstonecraft, Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and Simon Bolivar. And he's important in terms of Latin America, and what happens with Latin America and Spain, right? And so who it was Niccolo Machiavelli first. So he was alive between the years 1469 and 1527. And he was an Italian Renaissance, right? He lived during the Renaissance. And he was a historian. He was a politician. He was a diplomat, a philosopher. He was a writer. And he's often called the founder of modern political science. And he wrote this book called The Prince. And The Prince is a very influential text, and it was influential during his lifetime, and it's even influential up to today. And typically, it's mostly influential on politicians and philosophers. And basically, it's a guidebook. It provides strategies. It describes strategies on how to be an effective statesman, and how to gain power and to maintain power. And his assumption was that human nature is flawed, that we're flawed, that we're broken, we're not perfect, right? And his assumption is also reflected in the need for brute force to attain practical ends. So basically, he justified the use of violence to obtain and maintain power and control. And he describes one who deceives and manipulates others for gain. So what I mean by that is, when he was talking about who the perfect, the best statesman would be, who the most effective government ruler would be, it would be somebody who deceives, somebody who lies, somebody who manipulates others for their gain, right? So that's kind of what he argues for in his book, The Prince, right? And then we have the social contract theory. And so this is a theory, this is not a person, but the social contract theory was supported and argued for by several philosophers. And this theory basically, it says that people should give up, or people do give up, some of their rights, some of their liberties, to get a government in order to receive social order. And I'm going to say this another way as well, just so I'm clear on what it is. So it's this view that the government, the state, they get their legitimacy from people, that we consent to be governed by the state, and that we surrender specific rights in exchange for that social order. So think of a contract, right? Think of a contract. Whenever you sign a contract, you have two people coming together to agree to abide by something. They agree to the terms of the contract. So one side will say, I will do A, B, and C. And the other person who signs the contract will say, and I will do A, B, and C as well. And if neither of us uphold this bargain, this contract, then it'll be ripped up and it's null and void, right? You can throw out the contract. So when I'm talking about the social contract, I'm not talking about a physical piece of paper that we sign. Instead, it's an idea, right? It's an idea of a contract. And it explains the relationship between individuals, right? And the larger society or the government, right? So individuals agree to give up and surrender some rights, some of their rights, in exchange for the government promising to protect them and to maintain social order. And so this theory was uh, differentiated. So it was different. So that means it wasn't the same across, uh, all philosophers agreed upon the exact same social contract theory. It was a little bit different, and it could be applied in different forms of government. So some argued that the social contract should be upheld under a monarchy, with a king at the as the ruler and the head of the government. And then others argued for a council, an oligarchy, and that a social contract could be upheld in that form of government. And then others believed that a republic or a democracy, a government ruled by the majority, by the people themselves, would uphold a social contract. And that, so basically, we've already studied what each of these forms of government are. And a social contract theory, the social contract theory, isn't exclusive to just one of those. Different philosophers, like you see on the slide here, Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, they are some of the most famous philosophers of the social contract. And this social contract formed the theoretical groundwork of democracy as we know it today. But they each had a different understanding of what the social contract theory was and what its implications were. What would be the best form of government to uphold the social contract. So understand that they had different ideas on what this meant. Now, the first person we're going to talk about is Thomas Hobbes, right? And he was a British philosopher, and he lived during the English Civil War. And that was the period, remember, in our lesson on Monday, we talked about how England executed its king, King Charles, right? And by the very end of the Civil War, the parliament had grown more powerful, so there was more representation. People had more representation, and also the English had created the English Bill of Rights. Remember, so he was living during this period of time, Thomas Hobbes, and he wrote something called the Leviathan, and this publication expressed his ideas, his beliefs about politics and how society should be structured. And he was the first person to apply the scientific method, the scientific approach to study man and society and how society should be structured, right? And he believed that due to the scarcity of things in the world, that there is a constant war of all against all. So he believed, there is a limitation of natural resources. There's a limitation on the amount of food, the amount of water, the amount of land, and because of this scarcity, that's what scarcity means. That there's a limit to it, and there's not an unlimited amount of it, right? It can run out. So because those things can run out, there's constant war, there's constant violence and battling. And he believed people are naturally cruel, that they're selfish, destructive, unprincipled, they're always at war with each other, they're greedy. And if they're not controlled strictly by a government, that they would fight, rob, and oppress one another. So a life without controls by government would be poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And he believed in a need for an authoritarian dictator-like government. He believed that humans are rational and that they realized that their lives would be better if they cooperated and lived under the protection of a monarch, a king, a dictator, an authoritarian, right? And according to Hobbes, he's he still believed in the social contract. He still believed people needed to give up their freedom, give up some of their freedom to the king, to the authoritarian government, in exchange for protection by that king, right? And so he believed this monarchy, this authoritarian government, is required for there to be peace and cooperation in society, right? That's his belief. That's Thomas Hobbes. So he believes in a monarchy, and he believes people are naturally cruel and greedy. Now, the next one is John Locke. And John Locke is called the father of liberalism. That's what he's known as. He's a British philosopher as well. And he also he lived between the years 1632 and 1704, right? So he was around when the English Bill of Rights was created. And he has a more positive view, more optimistic view, but it's still, he believed people were naturally selfish. And he published something called the Second Treatise on Government. And he argued for something called natural rights. As you can see, I put he unlocked, get it, John Locke. He unlocked natural rights, right? And he believed that no matter what culture you're from, no matter where you lived, what time you grew up in, what period of history you grew up in, he believed all people have natural rights. And these rights, natural rights, constitute basic moral laws that, regardless of human nature, every person has these rights simply by virtue of being human. So just by you being a human being, you have certain rights. And these are the right to life, liberty, health, and property. And they are inalienable, meaning they cannot be taken away by anybody, right? So all people were equal and independent, and none had a right to harm another person. So if you did harm or try to take away someone's life, health, liberty, or possessions, then that meant that that could be taken away from you, right? And so he just Locke and Hobbes, they did agree that humans are naturally selfish, but he didn't believe that certain rights could be taken away, right? That because people are selfish, because people are greedy, that they might try to take away some of these natural rights. And because of John Locke, we get the rule of law, the idea of rule of law, the Constitution. He helped to inspire the idea of due process, right? So that you need to be charged with a crime, and you need to be convicted of a crime before these rights could be taken away from you. He believed that there should be a government, that it should be a limited government, right? It shouldn't have the ability to take away these rights, but it should be there to protect those rights from being taken away. That's what his idea was of the government. So he believed in the freedom of individuals. He wanted freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of free market. Those were ideas that we have in our Constitution, and that many other countries have adopted as well. And we find that John Locke is really the source of these ideas. We take a lot of these ideas from him and from his writing. And he advocated for something called governmental checks and balances. And he believed that revolution is not only a right but an obligation. So he believed that government should be split into there should be forms of government that can check one another, that should prevent one branch of the government from becoming too powerful, right? And becoming a tyrannical or a dictatorship, right? And so he believed also that if a government is abusing its people, if a government is infringing on these natural rights and failing to protect these rights of life, liberty, and property, that people have a right to revolt and rebel, and they have a right to engage in a revolution and overthrow that government. So his influence, his ideas, these types of ideas, were used by the colonists in the American Revolution, by the French during the French Revolution, So it could be that without his ideas of natural rights, that the Americans might never have declared independence. It could be that they might have stayed under the British crown, because we see in the Declaration of Independence and in the Constitution that the colonists were directly inspired. They directly cited these ideas. Thomas Jefferson himself, he was the main writer behind the Declaration of Independence. He says that people have a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He pretty much plagiarized John Locke, right? So he copied John Locke's ideas almost exactly in declaring why America wanted to become independent from England, right? And here at the quote, there's a quote at the bottom. It says, "Government has no other end but the preservation of property." So he viewed property, the idea of private property, as one of the most important rights, that people have a right to own their own property and not have it taken away. And so he believes that the government's ultimate purpose, its most important purpose, is to protect our right to own our property and not have it taken away, to protect our right uh, to own property. So I'm going to stop the lesson here. We'll pick back up with this discussion of different Enlightenment thinkers in our upcoming lessons. But so make sure that you fill out the compare and contrast Venn diagram that I have posted on Google Classroom. Really take a look at what similarities and differences there are between John Locke and Thomas Hobbes. What do they believe about people? What do they believe about the type of government that there should be? What's the role of government? How do they influence history and how in our society to this day? Think about these things and make sure you include some of that information so that way you can identify the differences between the two. So let me know if you need any help. I hope you learned something from today. If you need any help, make sure to email me, contact me through Remind, or reach out during class, unmute yourself, send me a message in the chat. That way I can help you, because philosophy can be something that's a little hard to understand, even for adults, grown adults. It can be difficult. So just let me know, and good luck on the assignment.